17-year-old Aiden Harrell shuffled into the courtroom in a wrinkled jail shirt, chains brushing the floor, a tiny smirk sitting on his face, like this was a misunderstanding that would soon be cleared up. He didn't look at his aunt's side of the family, the people dressed in black, touching each other in the front row. Instead, he glanced at the judge with the casual confidence of a teenager who still believed the rules would bend for him. He thought the word juvenile was a shield. He didn't know his own aunt's last whispered words were already waiting for him. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. If you believe in accountability, subscribe now and tell us what you think below. Because on the polished wood table in front of him, under bright evidence lights, it lay the quiet answer to every lie he was about to tell. A plastic bag holding a length of cleanly cut phone wire. Next to it, photographs of a knife pulled from the back of his bedroom closet. Behind him, a bailiff watched the smirk, the shrugging shoulders, the careless whispers during victim statements. The judge noticed too. This is how it all began. Chapter 1. The fluorescent lights in the Maricopa County courtroom hummed with a frequency that made everything feel clinical and cold. Aries shuffled to the defense table, his ankle chains creating a metallic rhythm that should have humbled anyone facing a murder trial. But the 17-year-old wore that sound like background music to his performance. He settled into his chair with the casual indifference of someone waiting for a movie to start. He's occasionally scanning the gallery with eyes that held no fear, no remorse, only the calculating patience of someone who believed this was all temporary. His jail-issued shirt was wrinkled, his hair uncombed, but his posture radiated the kind of confidence that made stomachs turn. When his gaze briefly swept over the victim's family in the third row, that familiar smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. The contrast was the first assault on anyone watching. Here sat a face that still carried traces of adolescence, smooth skin, the awkward angles of someone not quite finished growing. But behind those features lived something cold and methodical. When his attorney leaned over to whisper procedural details, Aries nodded with what looked almost like amusement, as if they were discussing weekend plans rather than second-degree murder charges. A quiet laugh escaped him during one exchange, barely audible, but loud enough to make two family members stiffen in their seats. The bailiff's jaw tightened, his stare hardening into something that could cut glass. The prosecutor organized her evidence folders with calm efficiency, knowing that the outcome was already written in forensic reports and witness statements. Everyone understood the gravity of this moment except the one person who should have felt it most. On the evidence table near the prosecution sat a clear plastic bag, tagged and cataloged with the precision that turns tragedy into legal record. Inside was a section of phone wire, severed cleanly, the copper strands exposed where deliberate cuts had been made. A detective had photographed those cuts from multiple angles, documenting the clean edges that spoke of calculation rather than panic. Wire doesn't tear itself during emotional distress. Someone had taken a tool and methodically removed the house's ability to call for help. The bag sat there like a silent witness, waiting for its moment to speak. When Aries glanced at the evidence table, his jaw tightened for just a fraction of a second before the mask of indifference returned. That flicker was everything, the crack in his performance where reality bled through. In the gallery, the victim's sister sat with tissues already in her hands, caught in an impossible position that defied comprehension. She was both grieving sibling and defending mother, forced to exist in the space between loving her son and mourning her sister. Her face showed the cognitive dissonance of someone whose world had been split down the middle. Around her, other family members clutched photographs of Tanya, their eyes red from crying that had started months ago and never really stopped. Their grief filled the courtroom like a presence you could feel but couldn't name. Aries shifted in his seat, chains clinking softly, and for a moment he looked almost annoyed by their sorrow, as if their pain was an inconvenience to his carefully constructed narrative. Aries had walked into this courtroom carrying a fortress of delusions built on his birth certificate. In his mind, the system would look at his youth and see potential rather than premeditation. He expected therapy recommendations, perhaps a juvenile facility that felt more like boarding school, and eventually a clean slate. He had convinced himself that his age was armor against accountability, that a few well-placed tears and claims of confusion would rewrite the story of what he had done. He whispered something else to his attorney, who responded with a tight nod that looked more like a warning than agreement. The teenager still believed he could charm his way out of consequence, that adults would doubt their own conclusions when faced with someone so young. But there was one piece of evidence that would cut through every excuse and manufactured confusion like a blade through silk. The prosecutor stood, adjusting her papers, preparing to introduce the most devastating testimony of all. This witness wasn't sitting in the hallway waiting to be called. She wasn't even alive. But Tanya Harper, bleeding and fighting for consciousness in her final moments, she had used her last breath of clarity to name her attacker. She had looked at her sister, pressed her hands to her wounded neck, and spoken the words that would become the foundation of everything that followed. "I think Aries did it." Not speculation born of panic, but a dying declaration from a woman who knew exactly who had shattered her sense of safety. The judge entered with the measured authority of someone who had read every document and understood exactly what this case represented. Judge Jeffrey Reuter carried himself with the quiet power of someone unmoved by youth, theatrics, or carefully crafted explanations. His eyes settled on the defendant with clinical detachment, the look of a surgeon who had spotted a malignancy and was preparing to remove it. This was not a judge who would be seduced by age or charm. This was someone who had seen the severed phone wire, read about the hidden cell phones, and understood that some acts of violence are so calculated that birthdays become irrelevant. The evidence bag with the copper wire caught the overhead light for a moment, glinting like a small accusation. Aries looked at it again, longer this time, and the smirk finally began to fade. He thought he'd never be caught, believed he had created the perfect storm of confusion and opportunity. But wire doesn't negotiate, and forensic evidence doesn't feel sympathy for youth. The severed strands sat there in their plastic tomb, waiting to tell their story about control, planning, and a teenager who believed he could silence a house and walk away untouched. He was about to learn that sometimes the smallest pieces of evidence speak the loudest truths. Chapter 2. Tanya Harper was the kind of person who turned houses into homes without even trying. She worked a steady job that gave her the security to be generous with what she had, and her coworkers knew her as the one who remembered birthdays and brought extra lunch when someone mentioned being broke. Her laugh was the kind that filled kitchens, genuine and warm, the sound that made strangers feel welcome at family gatherings. In the mornings, she drank coffee from the same chipped blue mug she'd had for years, one with a fading floral pattern that friends suggested she replace. She always refused, saying some things were too comfortable to throw away. That mug would later sit untouched in an empty kitchen, a quiet reminder of everything that had been lost in a single night of calculated violence. The Sun Lakes neighborhood where Tanya lived embodied Arizona's version of suburban peace. Manicured streets stretched between houses where retirees played early morning golf and families walked dogs in the evening coolness. Hedges were trimmed with precision, driveways swept clean, and the loudest sounds most nights were sprinkler systems clicking on at programmed intervals. This was the kind of community where people left garage doors open while running quick errands, where neighbors knew each other's names and watched each other's homes during vacations. Violence didn't live here, or so everyone believed. It was the last place anyone expected to become the setting for a story that would end in a courtroom with a teenager in chains. When Tanya offered to host the family reunion, nobody questioned it because that's simply what she did. She transformed her home into a temporary hub where relatives could reconnect without the expense of hotels or the formality of restaurant gatherings. Storage rooms suddenly had air mattresses and fresh linens. The living room couch became someone's bed, and phone chargers multiplied on kitchen counters like electronic weeds. The refrigerator overflowed with contributions from everyone who arrived, creating the beautiful chaos of a house filled with people who shared blood and history. Tanya moved through it all with practiced ease, making sure everyone felt included and cared for, treating hosting not as a burden, but as an opportunity to strengthen the bonds that kept families together. Aries wasn't a stranger crashing this gathering. He was family, invited and welcomed without reservation. Tanya treated him with the same mixture of warmth and gentle authority she extended to all the younger relatives, seeing in him not a threat, but simply her sister's son who needed guidance like any teenager. But beneath the surface of adolescent normalcy, tensions simmered in ways that adults often missed or dismissed as typical growing pains. Aries carried himself with the sullen entitlement common to teenagers who resented being told what to do, but his resentment ran deeper than most. He bristled at bedtimes, rolled his eyes at simple requests, and radiated the kind of moodiness that relatives excused as just a phase while secretly counting the days until he'd outgrow it. The dynamic between aunt and nephew represented something more dangerous than anyone realized. Authority without cruelty, meeting entitlement without boundaries. Tanya responded to his attitude not with anger, but with patient firmness, believing that structure was an expression of love rather than control. She didn't see herself as his enemy, but Aries interpreted every rule as a personal attack, every expectation as a chain around his freedom. In his adolescent worldview, being powerless was the ultimate humiliation, and Tanya's refusal to let him operate without consequences made her the perfect target for someone who craved absolute control. He didn't see an aunt who cared enough to set boundaries. He saw an obstacle between himself and the unchecked power he believed he deserved. The house itself contained a detail that seemed meaningless that evening, but would later become crucial in ways nobody could anticipate. Tanya still maintained a landline phone in the hallway, on one of those increasingly rare home phones that younger relatives teased her about as old-school technology. When they asked why she bothered when everyone carried cell phones, Tanya would just smile and say she liked having a backup, something reliable that didn't depend on batteries or signal strength. That phone line ran through the walls of her home like a lifeline, connecting her to emergency services, to neighbors, to the outside world that could send help if needed. It was such an ordinary detail, the kind of infrastructure people never think about until it becomes the difference between life and death. As evening settled into night, the house began its comfortable transition towards sleep. Relatives claimed their makeshift beds, navigating around each other with the practiced choreography of family gatherings that had happened dozens of times before. Lights clicked off in stages as people drifted toward rest, conversations fading into the quiet hum of a house at peace. The refrigerator hummed its mechanical lullaby, the air conditioning cycled on and off, and outside the windows, the neighborhood surrendered to darkness, punctuated only by streetlights and the occasional porch lamp. Everyone settled into the false security that comes from being surrounded by family, that dangerous assumption that nothing bad can happen when you're among people who share your blood and your memories. But while everyone else surrendered to sleep, one person remained awake with purpose that had nothing to do with insomnia or restlessness. Aries had lived in this house before. I moved through these hallways at night, learned which floorboards creaked and which doors opened silently. He knew where the landline connected to the wall, which outlets held phone chargers, where relatives had carelessly set their devices before settling in for the night. While everyone else viewed Tanya's home as a sanctuary, he cataloged its vulnerabilities with the cold efficiency of someone planning an attack. A family sees comfort and safety. Someone with malicious intent sees weaknesses to exploit and opportunities to create. The sound came softly in the darkness, almost imperceptible against the backdrop of a sleeping house, a faint, deliberate snip that didn't belong in the symphony of night sounds. It wasn't the creak of settling wood or the whisper of someone turning over in their sleep. It was sharper and more purposeful. The sound of wire parting under pressure, copper strands separating, insulation splitting to expose the metal beneath. In that quiet hallway where a small nightlight glowed like a guardian, someone was severing the house's connection to help, one cut at a time. While families slept in the trust that comes from shared love, someone was ensuring that when screams came, they would echo into a silence no one could break. Chapter 3. The house settled into the deepest part of night, that dangerous window between midnight and dawn, when sleep feels heaviest and the world outside holds its breath. Most of the family had surrendered completely to rest, their bodies relaxed in the trust that comes from being surrounded by loved ones in familiar walls. But while everyone else dreamed, one person remained awake with purpose that had nothing to do with insomnia. Aries moved through the darkened hallway with the practiced confidence of someone who had rehearsed these steps in his mind dozens of times before. He avoided the creaky floorboard near the bathroom, sidestepped sleeping relatives, and navigated toward the kitchen with surgical precision. This wasn't the clumsy movement of teenage mischief. This was choreographed violence waiting for its moment to perform. The refrigerator's mechanical hum provided cover for the small sounds he couldn't eliminate entirely. The soft whisper of bare feet on linoleum, the barely audible rustle of fabric as he moved. In the dim glow of appliance lights, his silhouette paused at the counter where ordinary kitchen tools waited in their wooden block. He didn't grab the first knife he touched. He selected a specific blade, testing its weight in his palm like a craftsman choosing the right tool for a job. The metal felt cold and substantial, its edge sharp enough to slice vegetables for family dinners. Under any other circumstances, it was just a utensil. In his grip, it transformed into something else entirely, an instrument of control that would rewrite every relationship in this house. What drove him in those quiet moments remained murky even to those who would later dissect his psychology. But the pattern suggested someone desperate to escape the powerlessness of adolescence. He wanted freedom from rules, escape from consequences, perhaps access to money, or simply the intoxicating rush that comes from making others afraid. The specifics of motive would remain buried under layers of lies and self-serving explanations. But his actions spoke with crystal clarity about someone who craved absolute authority. In his twisted worldview, Tanya represented everything that kept him small: structure, expectations, the gentle but firm voice that said no when he demanded yes. Removing her wasn't about hatred in any traditional sense. It was about eliminating the obstacle between himself and the unchecked freedom he believed was his birthright. Before he even approached his aunt's room, Aries began constructing the conditions that would make his crime survivable. He found where the phone line connected to the wall in the hallway, that old-school landline Tanya had insisted on keeping despite everyone's gentle teasing about outdated technology. With a tool he had located earlier, perhaps kitchen scissors, perhaps something sharper, he made clean, deliberate cuts through the wire. The copper strands separated under pressure, the plastic insulation splitting to expose the metal that carried voices and emergency calls to the outside world. These weren't the frantic tears of someone overwhelmed by emotion. These were measured cuts made by someone who understood that every second of delayed help increased his chances of walking away untouched. The cell phones came next, a systematic collection that demonstrated planning rather than passion. He moved through the house like a methodical thief, gathering devices from nightstands and kitchen counters where relatives had carelessly left them before surrendering to sleep. Each phone represented a potential lifeline, and a direct connection to help that could arrive in minutes if someone managed to dial emergency services. Aries collected them with the cold efficiency of someone removing hope itself, understanding that these devices weren't just communication tools, they were the difference between rescue and tragedy. He didn't smash them in rage or destroy them dramatically. He simply hid them where frantic hands wouldn't find them in the dark, buying himself precious minutes that would stretch into the space between intervention and irreversible loss. With the house effectively silenced and isolated from outside help, Aries approached the room where Tanya slept. She was deeply unconscious, or perhaps floating in that vulnerable space between dreams and waking, completely unaware that danger had been moving through her home for several minutes. The attack came with the suddenness that defines nightmare scenarios, that moment when safety shatters without warning or explanation. Tanya's eyes opened to confusion and pain, her mind struggling to process what was happening while her body reacted with primal instinct to protect her neck and fight for survival. There was no dramatic confrontation, no movie-style dialogue, just the brutal reality of violence inflicted by someone she had welcomed into her home and treated like family. Even as her world collapsed into chaos and agony, even as her body began shutting down from trauma, Tanya's mind held on to one crucial piece of information that would survive long enough to destroy her attacker's carefully constructed lies. What happened next revealed something perhaps more disturbing than the violence itself. Then, after leaving his aunt wounded and fighting for her life, Aries returned to his sleeping area and lay down as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. According to testimony that would later chill courtrooms, he actually went back to sleep, not the restless, nightmare-haunted sleep of someone traumatized by their actions, but the calm rest of someone who viewed violence as a completed task. He closed his eyes while Tanya struggled upstairs, while her blood soaked into carpet and fabric, while her body fought desperately to maintain consciousness long enough to identify her attacker. This wasn't the behavior of someone overwhelmed by emotion or acting in confused panic. This was detachment so profound it bordered on inhuman, the ability to commit calculated violence and then reset as if nothing meaningful had occurred. A kitchen knife returned to shadow, carefully placed where it might not be immediately discovered by the chaos that would soon follow. A teenager returned to his makeshift bed, pulling blankets over himself with the casual ease of someone settling in for an ordinary night's rest. The house remained quiet around him, still holding its illusion of safety even as tragedy unfolded in one of its rooms. He had severed the wires, hidden the phones, created what he believed was the perfect environment for his crime to succeed without consequences. In his adolescent arrogance, he thought the house would forget what he had done, believed that by manufacturing confusion and delay, he could walk away from this night as if it had never happened. But houses remember everything, in bloodstains and severed copper, in hidden devices and forensic evidence that doesn't sleep or negotiate. The story was already being written in ways he couldn't control or erase, and his victim's dying words would soon transform his perfect plan into the foundation of his own destruction. Chapter 4. The sound that shattered the night's silence wasn't a scream, but something more desperate, the frantic shuffle of someone fighting to stay alive. Tanya stumbled from her room with both hands pressed against her neck, blood seeping between her fingers in ways that made reality feel impossible. Each step required tremendous will as her body began shutting down from trauma and blood loss. She navigated the darkened hallway toward where her sister slept, leaving faint traces on walls where she steadied herself. The nightlight's soft glow blurred at the edges of her vision, but she pushed forward anyway, driven by one overwhelming need: to reach someone who could hear her final words before her strength was completely gone. When Tanya appeared in her sister's doorway, swaying and struggling to speak, the house erupted into controlled chaos. Lights snapped on in rapid succession as relatives woke to the nightmare unfolding in their midst. Voices overlapped in panic and confusion. What happened? Who did this? Get help. The soundscape of a family moving from peaceful sleep to crisis in heartbeats. Someone grabbed towels to apply pressure to wounds they couldn't fully see in the dim lighting, while others immediately reached for the devices that had become extensions of modern life. Cell phones. The obvious solution. The immediate lifeline to emergency services that every family counted on in moments exactly like this one. But as frantic hands searched nightstands and counters where phones had been carefully placed just hours before, a more sinister reality began to emerge. The devices were gone, not misplaced or accidentally knocked to the floor, but completely absent from where they had been deliberately set. Someone shouted to try the landline, that old-fashioned backup Tanya had maintained despite gentle family teasing about outdated technology. A relative ran to the hallway phone and lifted the receiver, already mentally rehearsing the address they would give to emergency dispatchers. Instead of a reassuring dial tone, there was only dead silence, the kind of emptiness that speaks louder than noise. They pressed buttons frantically, and as if repetition might resurrect the connection, but the phone remained lifeless in their grip. The family's panic shifted from the visible injury to the terrifying absence they couldn't explain. This wasn't random violence or a crime of opportunity. Someone had deliberately cut them off from help, had methodically removed every lifeline before striking. The house had been transformed into an island where screams echoed into manufactured silence. A relative finally grabbed car keys and sprinted toward a neighbor's house, pounding on doors in the pre-dawn darkness until someone answered and allowed them to dial emergency services. Those minutes stretched like hours, each second representing blood loss and fading consciousness. The difference between survival and tragedy measured in the time it took to find a working phone outside their sabotaged home. When deputies finally arrived, their body cameras became the audience's eyes into those crucial first moments. The footage showed harsh flashlight beams cutting through darkness, illuminating faces frozen in shock and grief. Radio static crackled as officers called for medical backup, their voices maintaining professional calm while documenting the physical evidence of violence. Blood trails, the severed phone wire dangling from the wall, the conspicuous absence of cell phones in a house where everyone treated their devices as lifelines. Every frame told a story about premeditation, about someone who had planned this attack with enough foresight to eliminate the variables that might lead to rescue or capture. But the most devastating evidence captured that night came from Tanya's own lips as paramedics worked frantically to stabilize her for transport. With her sister leaning close to hear words that came out in barely audible whispers, Tanya used whatever strength remained to deliver the truth that would echo through courtrooms months later. "I think Aries did it," she managed to say, each word costing precious energy her body desperately needed for survival. It wasn't speculation born from panic or confusion. It was a dying declaration from a woman who understood exactly what had happened and who was responsible. The statement carried the weight of recognition and betrayal, delivered not as theory, but as final testimony from someone who had seen her attacker's face. The accusation hit Tanya's sister like a physical blow, fracturing her reality in ways that would never fully heal. She was simultaneously a mother, hearing her son accused of unthinkable violence, and a sister watching her sibling bleed from wounds that might prove fatal. Her voice shook as she tried to process information her heart refused to accept, caught between the instinct to defend her child and the horror of what she was being told. "That's my son," she whispered, the words carrying the weight of a world collapsing. Other relatives heard the identification and looked toward where Aries had been sleeping, their faces showing the cognitive dissonance that comes from learning danger had lived among them, wearing a familiar face. While adults spiraled through shock and grief, trying to reconcile the teenager they knew with the monster being described. Aries himself appeared with an effect that struck trained law enforcement eyes as profoundly wrong. He emerged from his sleeping area looking sleepy and distant, his expression carrying none of the panic or concern that should accompany waking to such chaos. He moved through the scene like someone observing rather than participating, his posture slack and his eyes half-lidded as if he were still partly dreaming. When deputies asked basic questions about what he had heard or seen, his answers drifted and disconnected, the performance of someone trying to appear confused rather than the genuine disorientation of an innocent witness. He stood in the wreckage of his family, surrounded by blood and tears and emergency response, looking for all the world like he was waiting for a storm to pass. Your red and blue emergency lights continued washing over the living room where family photos hung on walls, images of birthday parties and holiday gatherings, frozen moments of happiness that now belonged to a different universe entirely. Paramedics loaded Tanya onto a stretcher, their movements efficient but urgent, everyone understanding that time had become the enemy. Deputies began the methodical work of securing the scene, photographing evidence, and separating witnesses for individual interviews. The truth was already present in that room, written in bloodstains and severed copper wire, waiting to be fully uncovered. It wore the face of a 17-year-old who believed his youth would protect him from consequence. It's someone who had engineered confusion and delay, but forgotten one crucial variable. Sometimes victims survive long enough to speak their killer's name into the record that never forgets. Chapter 5. By sunrise, Tanya's home had transformed into something unrecognizable. A sterile crime scene where yellow tape replaced family warmth and evidence markers dotted the landscape like small accusations. Investigators moved through rooms with practiced precision, their latex gloves snapping into place with sounds that punctuated the heavy silence left behind by tragedy. The metallic smell of blood mixed with the artificial scent of cleaning products someone had desperately used before being stopped by arriving officers. Cameras clicked in steady rhythm, documenting angles and distances, preserving the physical reality of violence before time could alter the scene. The house that had hosted laughter just hours before now existed as a series of photographs and numbered tags, each one representing a piece of the story that would eventually be reconstructed in courtrooms. The severed phone wire immediately drew investigators' attention, becoming the first undeniable sign that this attack had been carefully orchestrated rather than impulsively executed. A detective knelt beside the dangling cord, using a flashlight to examine cuts that spoke with devastating clarity about intent and planning. The wire hadn't been yanked or torn in panic, it had been sliced with surgical precision, the copper strands separated in clean cuts that required both tool and forethought. The location mattered too. Positioned exactly where it would disable communication without being immediately visible to someone walking past in darkness. Each photograph of those exposed copper strands would later become courtroom evidence of premeditation, proof that someone had understood eliminating help was the first step in creating an environment where violence could succeed without immediate intervention. The search for the weapon began with methodical precision, investigators understanding that concealment patterns reveal psychology as clearly as fingerprints reveal identity. They moved room by room, checking obvious locations first, kitchen drawers, bathrooms, trash bins, before expanding to unlikely hiding spots where someone with calculation might stash evidence they planned to retrieve later. Closets were examined shelf by shelf, laundry baskets sorted item by item, spaces between furniture inspected with flashlights that revealed dust patterns and recent disturbances. The logic became clear. This wasn't a weapon discarded in panic or abandoned at the scene. Someone had taken time to hide evidence, believing they would have opportunity to dispose of it more permanently once the initial chaos subsided. The breakthrough came in Ares's personal space, that collection of belongings teenagers guard jealously from adult intrusion. Hidden among ordinary clothes and everyday items, investigators found the kitchen knife that matched the set from Tanya's block, but now it carried dark stains that field testing would preliminarily identify as blood. The discovery represented more than just evidence. It was a devastating punch to any narrative of innocence or confusion. Oh, this wasn't a tool dropped during panic or left behind by an intruder. This was evidence deliberately concealed in private space by someone who understood that possession connected them to crime and who believed they had time to clean up their mess. The knife's location spoke with devastating clarity. Only someone with access to that room could have hidden it there. When confronted with questions about the weapon's presence in his closet, Aries offered explanations that seemed to reshape themselves depending on which investigator asked and how questions were framed. He claimed not to remember, then suggested maybe he had picked it up during chaos without thinking, then wondered aloud if someone else might have placed it there to frame him. His answers carried the hallmark of someone constructing alibis in real time rather than recounting actual memories. Too many qualifiers, too much selective amnesia about crucial details while maintaining perfect recall of irrelevant minutiae. Detectives recognize the pattern from countless interrogations. Innocent people usually remember trauma vividly, while guilty people often curate their memories to fit narratives of non-involvement. His selective forgetfulness became its own kind of evidence. Digital forensics added another layer to the emerging picture, technicians extracting data that would reveal patterns invisible to casual observation. Even without immediate access to every device, investigators could see gaps in activity that defied explanation for a modern teenager. Call logs showed silence during hours when most teens are active on social media. Location data revealed devices moving in patterns that suggested deliberate concealment rather than casual use. The phones told stories about systematic removal from common areas, about devices being powered down or hidden in locations far from where their owners had left them. Each recovered phone became a piece of the timeline puzzle, showing not just what had happened, but when and in what sequence. Family members provided crucial testimony about their missing devices, each account building the case for systematic sabotage rather than random theft. "I put it right here on the nightstand," one relative insisted, pointing to a spot now occupied only by a lamp. "Mine was charging in the kitchen," another said, gesturing to an empty outlet. The phones hadn't been stolen for profit. No wallets or jewelry had been taken. They had been removed to silence the house, gathered and hidden by someone who knew exactly where everyone kept their lifelines to the outside world. That level of intimate knowledge pointed directly to someone inside the family circle, someone who had watched routines and noted habits with predatory attention to detail. As investigators compiled their findings, an undeniable pattern emerged that was impossible to dismiss as coincidence or accident. Multiple cell phones removed from accessible locations. A landline severed with clean, deliberate cuts. A weapon hidden in the suspect's private space. A victim's dying declaration naming her attacker. The timeline showed opportunity and access. Aries had been in the house, knew the layout. "I understood where people slept and where communication devices were kept." His behavior after the attack defied every normal pattern of innocence. The unnatural calm, the claimed sleep, the detachment from horror unfolding around him. Each piece of evidence stood alone as deeply concerning, but together they formed a narrative that pointed in one undeniable direction toward calculated violence disguised as adolescent confusion. An evidence photograph captured the closet shelf where the knife had been discovered, showing ordinary socks and folded T-shirts surrounding the sealed bag containing the instrument of his aunt's destruction. The image would later be projected on courtroom screens, allowing jurors to see how mundane domesticity had concealed calculated harm. Aries had hidden the tool among the everyday artifacts of teenage life, believing that proximity to normalcy would somehow erase the blade's violent history. But investigators understood what he had failed to grasp in his adolescent arrogance. Hiding evidence doesn't eliminate it, and sometimes the act of concealment speaks louder than the evidence itself. He had wrapped metal in fabric and called it hope, but the house had already started talking back in the only language it knew, through severed copper hidden phones, and the quiet testimony of where things belonged and where they had been deliberately moved. Chapter 6. The interrogation room existed as a monument to institutional discomfort. Cinder block walls painted that particular shade of beige that suggested surrender. Fluorescent lights that buzzed with headache-inducing persistence. And a metal table bolted to concrete floors as if violence was always expected. The temperature stayed deliberately cold, the chairs designed to discourage relaxation during hours of questioning that could stretch toward dawn. When Aries was led into that space, still wearing the wrinkled clothes he had slept in while his aunt fought for her life, he settled into his chair with a casualness that made every detective in the building take notice. This wasn't the trembling fear of innocence under pressure. This was someone preparing to perform, adjusting his posture like an actor finding his mark before the cameras rolled. Instead of the breakdown that typically accompanies teenagers facing murder accusations, our Aries leaned back as far as his restraints allowed and scanned the room with calculating eyes that seemed to be pricing everything for future negotiation. He accepted the offered cup of water with a slight smile, as if appreciating the hospitality rather than recognizing the psychological strategy. His entire escape plan rested on a foundation of adolescent arrogance. Adults were ultimately manipulable if you understood their weaknesses and played to their desire to see youth as inherently redeemable. He would claim confusion, suggest an intruder, hint that family members were scapegoating him to protect someone else. Each layer was designed to create reasonable doubt, to make authority figures question their own conclusions when faced with someone whose birth certificate said he was too young to be truly dangerous. The lead detective employed a strategy refined through decades of watching lies crumble under patient pressure. She started with gentle questions about the evening's timeline, her voice conversational and non-threatening, creating the illusion that this was fact-finding rather than an interrogation designed to expose calculated deception. Aries answered easily at first, his timeline matching other witnesses, his demeanor suggesting someone eager to help solve a mystery he had no part in creating. But experienced investigators understand that guilty people often rush to fill silence with explanations that dig their holes deeper, and she was prepared to wait for the inevitable moment when his story would collide with physical evidence that couldn't be charmed away. The shift came when she slid a clear evidence bag across the table, its contents immediately recognizable as the severed phone wire from Tanya's hallway. The copper strands gleamed under harsh fluorescent light, their clean cuts speaking with devastating clarity about intent and premeditation. "Who would benefit from the phones not working?" she asked quietly, the question containing layers of implication that struck Aries like a physical blow. His face flickered for just a fraction of a second, jaw tightening, eyes narrowing, the first genuine crack in his carefully maintained mask of confused innocence. He recovered quickly, suggesting maybe an intruder had cut the lines, but his voice carried a new edge that hadn't existed moments before. And the detective let silence fill the room, like water finding every crack in his foundation. When confronted with the systematic collection of hidden cell phones, Aries's narrative began showing visible strain under the weight of its own absurdity. How would an intruder know where every family member kept their devices? Why remove phones but leave valuable electronics untouched? His answers started contradicting each other in small but significant ways, first claiming he had been asleep the entire time, then mentioning hearing something that might have been movement, then backtracking to suggest maybe he had dreamed it all. The knife discovery became the interrogation's turning point, the piece of evidence that couldn't be explained through vague claims of confusion or conspiracy theories. When shown photographs of the weapon hidden in his closet, his casual posture vanished, replaced by rigid tension that made his shoulders rise toward his ears. Outside the interrogation room, family members provided statements that tightened the evidentiary net with each interview. their testimony corroborating elements of the prosecution's timeline while dismantling any narrative of confused innocence. Relatives described the eerie calm of finding Aries sleeping while chaos erupted upstairs, noted how his effect seemed wrong, even accounting for shock, remembered Tanya's dying words with crystal clarity. "I think Aries did it." Each statement built upon the others like layers of sediment, creating geological proof of guilt that no amount of teenage charm could erode. Their grief was real, their confusion genuine, but their observations were devastating in their consistency. The decision came swiftly from prosecutors who recognized that some crimes transcend the age of their perpetrators. Aries would be charged as an adult despite his youth. The announcement shattered his carefully constructed confidence like glass meeting concrete, visible even through the interrogation room camera's grainy footage. His face registered genuine fear for the first time, the realization dawning that his birth certificate wouldn't function as the shield he had believed it to be. Adult charges meant adult consequences, real prison time measured in years rather than months, a future that suddenly looked nothing like the therapy and release fantasy he had been counting on throughout this entire performance. The interrogation camera's timestamp continued its relentless march forward, each passing second documenting the moment when time, his favorite hiding place, his greatest ally in the fantasy of escaping consequence, began turning against him with mechanical precision that cared nothing for his youth or his carefully rehearsed explanations. He had walked into this room believing he was the smartest person in the building, the architect of a perfect crime who could talk his way out of anything. Now he sat surrounded by evidence he couldn't explain away, watching adults who refused to be charmed by his age or confused by his lies. The camera recorded every micro-expression, every nervous swallow, every crack in the facade where reality was beginning to leak through. Time, which he had tried so desperately to control by cutting wires and hiding phones, was now working against him in ways he had never imagined possible. Chapter 7. The days that followed felt suspended in a grief so thick it seemed a slow time itself, every simple task requiring conscious effort while minds struggled to process the impossible. Tanya's funeral took place under Arizona skies that seemed offensively beautiful, cloudless blue that belonged to celebrations rather than goodbyes. Inside the service, mourners clutched folded programs featuring a photograph of Tanya, caught mid-laugh, head thrown back with genuine joy, eyes crinkled with the kind of happiness that suggested someone had just called her name at a family barbecue. That image now existed in a different universe entirely, a frozen moment of warmth that made the present reality feel like a mistake that could still be corrected. Hands trembled as they passed tissues down rows of seats, each person carrying their own version of the same crushing realization. A voice that had filled kitchens with stories and laughter would now only be spoken about in past tense. At the center of that storm of grief stood Tanya's sister, occupying a position so impossible it felt almost cruel in its design. She existed simultaneously as grieving sibling and defending mother, her body present at the funeral while her mind fractured between irreconcilable realities. When people approached to offer condolences, she accepted their words with hollow nods, unable to articulate the space she now inhabited, loving her sister's memory while loving the son accused of destroying it. The cognitive dissonance created a kind of psychological whiplash that made breathing feel like a conscious choice rather than an automatic function. Some days she clutched at any shred of doubt she could find, telling herself that Tanya's dying words might have been confused, that investigators were misreading evidence. Other days she replayed every interaction with Aries, searching for warning signs that now seemed glaring in their absence. The impossible position extended beyond immediate family, creating fault lines that spread through the extended network of relatives and friends who had gathered for what was supposed to be a joyful reunion. Cousins who had played together as children now avoided eye contact across the funeral home, unsure how to navigate conversations that might require choosing sides between victim and accused. Holiday gatherings would shrink in the months ahead, invitations would stop arriving, and group chats would go silent as people chose loyalty, sometimes consciously, sometimes through the cowardice of inaction. The tragedy had started with one violent act, but its shockwaves were now measured in birthdays missed, phone calls avoided, and chairs left empty at dinners where unresolved tension took the place of conversation that once flowed as easily as wine. The broader community responded with stunned disbelief that bordered on outrage, the kind of collective shock that accompanies violence in places where such things aren't supposed to take root. Neighbors who had waved to Tanya while retrieving morning newspapers now gathered in small clusters on sidewalks, speaking in hushed tones about how you never really know what happens behind closed doors. The idea that a teenager had murdered his aunt during a family reunion felt like a fundamental breach of natural order, a violation of the unspoken contract that says home should be sanctuary and family should be safety. Porch lights began staying on a little later, doors were locked a little earlier, and that warm, open feeling the Sun Lakes neighborhood once wore like a badge faded into something more guarded and suspicious. The legal machinery continued grinding forward with relentless efficiency, defense attorneys filing motions, exploring every possible avenue that might reduce their clients' exposure to adult consequences. They hinted at mental health considerations, suggesting that Aries' actions were the result of untreated psychological conditions rather than calculated malice, and hoping to shift the narrative from premeditated murder to tragic breakdown. But prosecutors had anticipated this strategy and were prepared with counterarguments anchored in reporting that certain mental health claims would face significant admissibility challenges in the courtroom context. The judge would ultimately rule that some psychiatric evidence couldn't be presented in the way the defense had hoped, forcing the trial to focus on actions rather than abstract diagnoses. A boundary that many viewed as difficult but necessary, understanding that explanation is not the same as excuse. The prosecution's narrative crystallized around a theme that would become their hammer throughout the trial: manufactured helplessness. This wasn't a crime of passion or sudden emotional breakdown, they argued, but violence made easier and more lethal by systematic preparation. Phone lines cut to delay help, cell phones hidden to eliminate lifelines, a weapon concealed afterward to destroy evidence. Each action demonstrated forward-thinking calculation that directly contradicted any narrative of diminished capacity or confused impulse. The timeline showed someone who understood cause and effect well enough to create conditions favorable to his crime success. Someone who had turned sanctuary into crime scene with predatory precision. Most devastatingly, they had Tanya's dying declaration as their moral and evidentiary anchor. "I think Aries did it." 5 words that carried crushing weight precisely because they came from someone with no reason to lie, and every reason to speak truth in what she understood might be her final moments of consciousness. As the first preliminary hearing approached, the contrast between defendant and victim became the story's emotional engine that would drive everything forward. Tanya had opened her home believing family was sacred, treating her nephew with the same care she extended to everyone under her roof. Aries had exploited that trust with cold precision, using intimate knowledge of household routines to maximize his attack's effectiveness while minimizing his chances of immediate capture. The family's fracture deepened with each legal filing, some relatives demanding the harshest penalty allowed, while others clung to memories of birthday parties and school events, seeing not a calculated killer, but a deeply broken child who needed treatment more than punishment. Their division reflected a broader question that would echo through the courtroom. Does premeditation have an age limit, or do some actions speak so clearly about intent that birthdays become irrelevant in the scales of justice? When Aries walked into that first hearing, he carried himself with the same casual posture that had chilled investigators months earlier. shoulders relaxed, eyes scanning the room like he was pricing everything for future negotiation rather than facing the weight of murder charges. He seemed convinced that the adults in the room were simply playing roles in a drama that would eventually end with his release, that some combination of age and carefully crafted explanations would open doors back toward the freedom he believed was temporarily interrupted rather than permanently lost. But Judge Jeffrey Reuter watched from the bench with eyes that had seen too much to be swayed by performance, observing the defendant's casual demeanor and lack of visible remorse with the clinical assessment of someone trained to distinguish genuine confusion from calculated theater. The judge's pen moved across legal documents with deliberate strokes, each signature bringing the proceedings closer to a reckoning that would test whether justice could pierce the armor of adolescent arrogance. A coffin had been lowered into Arizona earth while legal documents were being filed in temperature-controlled offices. Grief walking beside justice in the strange parallel march that defines how societies process violence into accountability. Step by measured step toward a courtroom where the smirk would finally meet its match. Chapter 8. The courthouse hallways carried the particular acoustics of institutional power. Footsteps echoing off marble floors, hushed conversations bouncing between walls that had absorbed decades of human drama. The metallic clank of security checkpoints processing bodies through scanners designed to detect weapons that might disrupt justice's carefully choreographed ritual. The air conditioning blew too cold, a stark contrast to Arizona heat outside. I'm making everyone acutely aware of their own skin as they waited for the trial that would finally put words and numbers to months of living inside tragedy. When the heavy courtroom doors opened, the atmosphere shifted from restless to reverent instantly, voices dropping to whispers as people found seats in a space designed to transform raw human conflict into something measurable through procedures society had agreed carried legitimate authority. Aries entered through the defendant's door wearing civilian clothes, selected to make him appear younger and less threatening, a buttoned shirt slightly too large, khaki pants that gave him the appearance of someone dressed for a school presentation rather than a murder trial. But instead of the beaten posture many defendants adopt by trial time, he walked with detached looseness that suggested he still saw himself as separate from the system processing him. He settled at the defense table with movements suggesting boredom more than anxiety, occasionally leaning over to whisper comments to his attorney that sometimes produced what looked disturbingly like suppressed smiles. When someone in the victim's family sniffled loudly behind him, he glanced over his shoulder not with sympathy but irritation, as if their grief were an unwanted distraction from the show he believed this trial to be. Judge Jeffrey Reuter entered with measured authority of someone who had presided over hundreds of cases without ever confusing drama with justice, his black robe settling around him like a uniform carrying institutional legitimacy's weight. His voice, when he spoke, carried no theatricality, on no attempt to intimidate through volume, just steady cadence of someone understanding that real power doesn't announce itself because it exists in structures everyone has already agreed to respect. He had read every document, reviewed every piece of evidence, understood exactly what narrative the prosecution would build and how the defense would attempt dismantling it. This was a judge who would ensure rules were followed regardless of how emotionally charged testimony became, someone unmoved by youth, theatrics, or carefully crafted explanations designed to rewrite physical evidence. The prosecution's opening statement laid out their case with systematic precision of architects revealing blueprints, each element building upon previous to create structure supporting conviction's weight. The assistant district attorney walked the jury through timeline with careful attention to sequence and causation. A family gathering that should have been safe. Phone lines deliberately severed to delay help. Cell phones systematically hidden to eliminate lifelines. Violent attack on a woman who had welcomed her nephew into her home. Weapon hidden afterward in defendant's private space. She emphasized Tanya's dying declaration with reverence it deserved. "I think Aries did it." 5 words carrying devastating clarity precisely because they came from someone with no reason to fabricate and every reason to speak truth in what she understood might be final conscious moments. The defense countered with narrative built on doubt and diminished capacity. Their opening painting a confused teenager overwhelmed by circumstances he couldn't fully understand or control. They acknowledged Aries had been present, that evidence existed, connecting him to crime, but suggested premeditation was adult concept wrongly applied to adolescent behavior that was impulsive rather than calculated. The defense attorney's voice carried sympathetic tones, describing a young person whose brain wasn't fully developed, whose judgment was compromised by factors prosecution ignored in their rush to secure adult conviction. They hinted Tanya herself might have said frightening things to Aries, suggested wire-cutting and phone hiding might have been panic responses rather than calculated preparation. The first witnesses took the stand with voices trembling despite preparation. Our family members forced to relive the worst night of their lives under clinical questioning of attorneys needing specific details rather than emotional catharsis. A deputy described arriving to find chaos and blood, his body camera footage playing on courtroom screens, while he narrated the scene's confusion and Tanya's desperate communication attempts despite injuries. The footage showed harsh flashlight beams cutting through darkness, illuminated the severed phone wire dangling uselessly from wall, captured the moment when Tanya's identification of her attacker was recorded for posterity. Most devastatingly, it showed Aries's behavior after the attack. That surreal calm while his aunt fought for life upstairs, his detached demeanor that even panicked family members noticed as disturbing. The prosecution emphasized repeatedly what they called consciousness of guilt. Someone truly confused or traumatized by witnessing violence doesn't calmly return to sleep, doesn't maintain emotional distance, while family members scream around them. His post-crime nap became psychological fingerprint, evidence of someone viewing violence as completed task rather than traumatic event that should have shattered any ability to rest. When defense attempted reframing through cross-examination, suggesting shock manifests differently in different people, prosecution was ready with context dismantling that narrative. If he felt genuinely threatened, why not wake other adults? Why cut phone lines before any confrontation occurred? Why hide phones that could have brought help? And each question exposed fundamental weakness in framing premeditation as panic. The defense hinted at justification that had circulated in rumors, the claim Tanya had threatened Aries earlier that evening, something about not living much longer that might have triggered defensive reaction. But prosecution immediately challenged this alleged threat's credibility with brutal logic. If terrorized, why cut communication lines instead of calling for help? Why hide devices that could record threats or contact parents? The questions hung in air, dismantling self-defense narrative with systematic precision that left defense scrambling for alternative explanations. The jury's attention had shifted in ways suggesting they were no longer asking whether he was involved, but why he thought he could get away with it. Are their faces showing hardened assessment that comes from watching someone fail to demonstrate appropriate remorse? The courtroom clock continued its steady progress above the judge's bench, each tick bringing proceedings closer to the moment when 12 strangers would weigh evidence against doubt and render judgment on whether calculated intent transcends age as mitigating factor. Aries maintained his mask of casual indifference, occasionally adjusting his oversized shirt or glancing toward gallery as if checking who was watching his performance. But what he apparently didn't recognize was that his performance was failing, slowly but unmistakably. And the only person who couldn't see it was the one whose freedom depended on convincing 12 people that youth made him worthy of mercy rather than accountability. And the judge's pen moved across legal documents with deliberate strokes, each mark bringing them closer to reckoning that would test whether justice could pierce adolescent arrogance's armor. The courtroom didn't need his performance. It needed his facts, and facts were methodically building a cage he couldn't charm his way out of. Chapter 9. Evidence, when presented with surgical precision, doesn't tell a story. It forces the truth to reveal itself through the accumulated weight of undeniable facts. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as prosecutors began their systematic dismantling of innocence, the large projection screens mounted throughout the gallery becoming windows into the methodical planning that had preceded violence. The first image appeared with clinical clarity. Tanya's hallway in wide shot, or ordinary and familiar except for the phone cord dangling uselessly from the wall like a severed lifeline. The prosecutor moved through the visual narrative with practiced rhythm. Click, pause, explain. Each photograph tagged and cataloged according to protocols designed to transform tragedy into legally admissible proof. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted from restless anticipation to focused attention as jurors leaned forward to examine details that would collectively paint a devastating picture of calculated malice. A forensic technician took the stand to explain what the severed phone wire meant in practical terms, his laser pointer dancing over magnified images that revealed clean, deliberate cuts through copper strands. His testimony was stripped of dramatic flourishes and focused instead on mechanical reality. Wire that parts under panic looks fundamentally different from wire cut with intent and planning. These cuts showed zero characteristics of emergency tearing, no frayed edges, no multiple attempts, no signs of desperate yanking. Instead, the evidence revealed someone who had selected an appropriate cutting tool, located the connection point in darkness, and applied steady pressure until the house's primary lifeline to emergency services was completely severed. The sequence required finding the wire, choosing the right implement, and ensuring the connection was disabled. A series of conscious decisions rather than reflexive panic responses. And the technical analysis continued building an unshakable foundation for premeditation through mundane details that collectively created devastating implications. The phone line's specific location mattered enormously, positioned in a hallway where cutting it would disable communication without being immediately visible to someone moving through the house in darkness. The tool marks suggested kitchen scissors or similar household implement, rather than improvised tearing, indicating someone had methodically selected the right instrument for the job, rather than grabbing whatever happened to be nearby during emotional distress. Most critically, the timeline revealed forward-thinking calculation. The lines were cut before any confrontation occurred, meaning someone understood that eliminating emergency response capability was step one in creating an environment where violence could succeed without immediate intervention from outside help. The hidden cell phones became the prosecution's second exhibit in their systematic demonstration of calculated planning. Photographs showing the bizarre scavenger hunt investigators had conducted in the hours following the attack. A detective described finding devices scattered throughout the house in locations that defied any innocent explanation. One phone wedged behind furniture in a room the defendant had access to, another wrapped in clothing inside a closet, a third discovered on top of a high kitchen cabinet where no family member would have casually left it. The pattern emerged with undeniable clarity. Devices had been systematically collected from their normal charging locations and hidden in places requiring deliberate concealment effort. It was, as the prosecutor had described in opening statements, like someone walking through the house stealing oxygen from the air, removing the very capability that could bring rescue within minutes of an emergency call. A digital forensics expert walked the jury through what phone activity logs revealed about timing and sequence, translating technical data into narrative anyone could follow without specialized knowledge. The devices showed completely normal usage patterns throughout the evening, texts sent to friends, social media checked, alarms set for morning wake-ups, then sudden, complete silence during the exact window when the attack occurred. All that silence wasn't explained by batteries dying or devices being routinely powered down for sleep. It was explained by physical removal from their owner's possession by someone who understood that modern cell phones represented the primary threat to their plan's success. The expert emphasized what this pattern demonstrated about forward thinking. Emergency services could arrive within minutes if anyone managed to dial for help, so eliminating that possibility became essential preparation for violence. The knife discovery returned to center stage with photographs showing exactly where the weapon had been concealed among Ares's personal belongings. The images revealed the surreal juxtaposition of ordinary teenage life: folded clothes, school supplies, a random electronics surrounding the sealed evidence bag containing the instrument that had nearly ended his aunt's life. The kitchen set was displayed alongside, one empty slot in an otherwise complete block, the missing knife now resting in an evidence bag like a silent confession. A forensic technician testified about blood evidence recovered from the blade, explaining how preliminary field tests had indicated human blood and subsequent laboratory analysis had confirmed DNA matching the victim. The weapon hadn't been dropped in horror or discarded in panic. It had been cleaned and deliberately hidden in private space, where the defendant believed he would have time to retrieve it later for permanent disposal. Body camera footage played again, this time with prosecution directing jury attention to specific moments that revealed consciousness of guilt through behavior rather than words. The deputy's camera had captured Ares in those first chaotic minutes after Tanya identified him as her attacker, documenting his posture, his affect, his responses to questions about what he had heard or witnessed. The footage showed someone maintaining emotional distance while family members collapsed into grief around him, someone whose primary concern seemed to be managing his own presentation rather than processing trauma that should have shattered any teenager's ability to remain composed. When the deputy asked where he had been sleeping, Ares gestured casually toward his area, his voice carrying none of the trembling confusion that typically accompanies innocent witnesses caught in nightmare scenarios they cannot comprehend. The prosecution played audio of Tanya's sister recounting her dying declaration, the recording capturing raw emotion that no actor could replicate. The way her voice broke saying, "I think Ares did it." The disbelief mixing with horror as she processed her sister's accusation against her own son. That recording became the trial's emotional centerpiece, the moment when abstract legal concepts about evidence and reasonable doubt collided with visceral human reality of a woman forced to choose between believing her murdered sister or defending her accused child. The jury watched family members in the gallery react to hearing those words again, our tissues appearing in hands throughout the courtroom as grief reasserted itself despite months of processing and therapy sessions designed to help them cope with incomprehensible loss. Throughout the evidence presentation, Ares maintained his characteristic flat effect, occasionally whispering to his attorney, but showing none of the visible distress that typically accompanies defendants watching their alleged crimes reconstructed in clinical detail. His lack of reaction became its own form of evidence, not legally admissible in determining guilt, but psychologically significant in how jury members assessed his character and credibility. When particularly damaging evidence appeared on screens, he sometimes looked away with what appeared to be boredom rather than shame, on his body language suggesting he viewed this entire process as theater he was being forced to endure rather than accountability he had earned through calculated violence against someone who had welcomed him into her home. The defense attempted their counter-narrative through cross-examination, suggesting each piece of evidence could be interpreted in ways supporting impulsive panic rather than calculated planning. Maybe he cut the phone line in confused fear after some confrontation. Maybe he hid phones without understanding why. Maybe the knife ended up in his closet through some sequence of events he couldn't fully articulate because trauma had fragmented his memory of that night. But with each alternative explanation offered, the prosecution returned to the same devastating question that hung in courtroom air like smoke, impossible to wave away. If acting in panic, why take actions that required forward planning and deliberate execution? Panic doesn't involve collecting multiple devices from different locations throughout a house. Fear doesn't involve hiding weapons in private spaces for later disposal. The timeline was the enemy of every defense theory. You cannot claim reaction to trauma when the preparations for that trauma began an hour before the violence occurred. A photograph remained frozen on the screen as testimony concluded for the day. The evidence bag containing severed copper wire, its strands catching overhead lights and gleaming with metallic certainty that refused negotiation or reinterpretation. That small piece of cut cable had become the symbol of everything the prosecution was systematically proving. Control had been his weapon before the knife ever was. Isolation had been his strategy before violence became his tactic, and planning had been his methodology before panic could ever be claimed as his excuse. The wire didn't negotiate with alternative narratives or accept reinterpretations based on the defendant's age or claims of confusion. It simply existed as physical proof that someone had understood cause and effect well enough to eliminate variables that threatened their crime's success, and that understanding, that forward-thinking calculation, was the very definition of premeditation, regardless of how many birthday candles the person responsible had blown out over the years. Chapter 10. Understanding what drove Aries required examining patterns of behavior that existed long before violence became his chosen solution to powerlessness. But the courtroom demanded careful boundaries between observable conduct and clinical speculation. Without crossing into diagnostic territory that judges had ruled partially inadmissible, prosecutors could still paint a devastating portrait through witnesses who had watched his interactions with authority over years rather than months. A school counselor took the stand to describe a teenager who viewed rules not as guidance, but as personal attacks. Someone who responded to consequences with elaborate explanations designed to shift blame, rather than accept responsibility for choices that led to disciplinary action. His resentment toward authority figures ran deeper than typical adolescent rebellion. It carried the weight of genuine contempt, as if the very idea that adults could impose limits on his behavior was fundamentally offensive to his sense of natural superiority. The recurring motif that had haunted the investigation returned now as the lens through which everything else made sense. He thought he'd never be caught because he believed rules were ultimately negotiable, suggestions designed for people less clever than himself. His worldview rested on dangerous arrogance refined through years of watching adults make excuses for his behavior, relatives who interpreted his coldness as sensitivity, and his manipulation as misunderstood intelligence. He had learned early that tears could become tools, that selective memory could rewrite history, and that adults desperate to believe in redemption would often accept implausible explanations rather than confront the possibility that someone so young might be capable of calculated malice. His entire approach to the legal system reflected this fundamental misunderstanding. He genuinely expected that his age would function as armor, that some combination of youth and carefully rehearsed confusion would open doors back toward the freedom he believed was temporarily interrupted rather than permanently lost. Family manipulation became its own devastating exhibit as prosecutors demonstrated how Aries had weaponized love against those who cared about him most. He kept elaborate mental ledgers of perceived slights, who had forgotten his birthday, which relatives had given better gifts to siblings, moments when he felt his importance wasn't properly acknowledged, and would reference these grievances months later as justification for cold treatment or emotional punishment. His mother's testimony revealed years of him playing relatives against each other, telling different versions of events to different family members to create confusion and avoid accountability. When caught in lies, he would shift to tears and claims that everyone was ganging up on him, that nobody understood how hard his life was, that the family was treating him unfairly compared to other children. These weren't isolated incidents, but sustained patterns suggesting someone who viewed relationships primarily as opportunities for control and advantage, rather than genuine connection. His courtroom behavior throughout the trial became its own form of psychological evidence, observable patterns that allowed jurors to assess character without needing expert testimony to interpret what they were seeing with their own eyes. He seemed more comfortable when testimony grew emotional, when family members were crying or describing their heartbreak. In those moments, he would lean forward, almost engaged, as if drawing energy from others' pain. But when cold, hard facts of forensic evidence were presented, the wire cuts, the phone records, the DNA analysis, he would disengage completely, whispering to his lawyer or adjusting his clothes as if waiting for something more interesting to begin. The pattern suggested someone who believed he could manipulate emotional temperature in the room, i.e. that if he remained unmoved while others collapsed, he was somehow winning a psychological battle for dominance that existed only in his own mind. The prosecutor built toward a devastating reframing of what the defense had characterized as post-trauma response. His calm return to sleep after attacking his aunt wasn't dissociation or shock. It was indifference born from viewing violence as a completed task rather than life-altering trauma. Normal human psychology creates indelible memories around violent events. Even perpetrators typically experience racing thoughts, adrenaline surges, hypervigilance that makes sleep impossible for hours or days afterward. Aries had attacked a family member in her own home, left her bleeding and fighting for consciousness, then laid down and slept soundly enough that responding deputies had to wake him. That sequence wasn't explained by any trauma response documented in psychological literature. It was explained by someone who felt no genuine connection to their victim's humanity and viewed the attack with the same emotional weight most people assign to completing household chores. A timeline gap surfaced during testimony that became the prosecution's hammer against any narrative of confused impulse rather than calculated planning. Witness statements placed Aries awake and moving through the house during a 40-minute period that aligned precisely with when phone lines were cut and devices were systematically hidden throughout the home. He had told investigators he was sleeping during that entire window, but multiple family members remembered seeing lights on in areas he had access to, or hearing movement that suggested someone deliberately staying awake while others settled into rest. That missing time proved premeditation rather than impulse. You cannot accidentally cut phone lines over 40 minutes of unconscious activity, cannot systematically hide devices throughout a house while sleepwalking through trauma you haven't yet experienced. The gap was undeniable proof that preparation preceded violence by enough time to demonstrate forward thinking rather than reactive panic. The defense faced an impossible decision about whether to put Aries on the stand, understanding that his mouth might become the prosecution's most effective exhibit against him. His attorneys had spent months coaching him on appropriate affect, on teaching him when to show remorse and how to frame his actions as confused response rather than calculated attack. But they also understood that cross-examination would expose the fundamental weakness in his character, his inability to maintain consistent narrative under pressure, his tendency to shift blame when cornered, his lack of genuine emotional connection to the harm he had caused. The tension was visible as they whispered urgently during breaks, Aries pushing for the chance to speak, while his lawyers recognized the risk that one poorly timed smirk or defensive outburst could undo months of careful legal strategy designed to preserve whatever hope remained for mitigation rather than maximum sentencing. Throughout these deliberations, Aries continued adjusting his shirt cuffs with the same casual precision he had maintained since his first court appearance, the gesture revealing hands that trembled slightly despite his attempts to project calm control. He wasn't sorry for what he had done. Every behavioral indicator suggested someone whose primary emotion was frustration that his plan had failed rather than remorse for the suffering he had caused. His eyes continued scanning the jury box as if trying to identify which members might be most susceptible to sympathy based on age, watching for micro-expressions that might suggest doubt he could exploit during deliberation. He was still strategizing, still believing that the right combination of performance and manipulation might yet save him from accountability. What he apparently couldn't grasp was that his strategy was visible to everyone except himself, and that transparency had become the most damning evidence of all, proof that someone capable of this level of sustained deception understood exactly what they were doing when they turned sanctuary into crime scene and transformed family trust into fatal vulnerability. Chapter 11. The announcement came after hours of whispered conferences that stretched through the lunch recess, defense attorneys weighing catastrophic risks against the slim possibility that their client might somehow generate sympathy through direct testimony. When court reconvened, the decision landed with the weight of inevitability that everyone had been dreading. Aries would testify in his own defense, gambling everything on his ability to rewrite months of damning evidence through carefully rehearsed explanations and strategic displays of vulnerability. He approached the witness stand with movements that suggested someone preparing for a performance rather than moral reckoning, his hand steady as he raised it for the oath, while his eyes briefly scanned the jury box as if measuring his audience. His voice carried calm confidence as he swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Words that would prove tragically ironic, as his testimony systematically demolished whatever remained of his defense. His own attorney began with gentle questions designed to paint confusion and fear rather than calculation and malice, or each inquiry carefully constructed to elicit responses that might generate reasonable doubt about premeditation. Aries spoke in measured tones about feeling threatened by his aunt earlier that evening, claiming she had made statements about him not being around much longer that he interpreted as genuine danger rather than the frustrated discipline of someone dealing with a difficult teenager. His voice trembled at precisely calculated moments, his eyes occasionally filling with tears that never quite spilled over, the performance calibrated to suggest genuine trauma without crossing into theatrical excess that might alienate skeptical jurors. He admitted to cutting the phone line but framed it as panic response to feeling cornered, claimed he hid phones because confusion had fragmented his thinking, suggested his memory of the actual attack remained clouded by psychological shock too profound for linear recall. When he described the moment of violence itself, his language softened in ways that made prosecutors' pens still over legal pads with recognition of classic deflection techniques. He didn't say, "I attacked" or "I stabbed." Instead, he said, "Something happened," as if tragedy had simply materialized in the room, rather than being carried there in his own hands. He talked about floating outside his body, about time moving strangely, about actions that felt disconnected from conscious choice. The phrases sounded suspiciously similar to language commonly found in online articles about trauma rather than genuine personal experience, in each description carefully crafted to suggest diminished capacity while avoiding specific admissions that could be used against him during sentencing. His tears appeared on schedule when mentioning his mother, when acknowledging that Tanya was gone, when insisting he never meant for any of this to happen. But even through emotional displays, his words maintained strange distance from the actual acts of violence he was being forced to acknowledge. But when the prosecutor rose for cross-examination, the courtroom atmosphere shifted like air pressure dropping before a storm, everyone understanding that the careful narrative constructed over months was about to face systematic demolition. She began not with accusations, but with simple timeline questions that seemed almost conversational, forcing Aries to commit to minute-by-minute details that would become the foundation for exposing every contradiction in his story. What time had he gone to bed? Who was still awake when he last saw them? Where had he noticed phones being left for overnight charging? At first, he handled these questions reasonably well, staying close to testimony that aligned with other witnesses. But as she moved into the 40-minute gap that had become the prosecution's anchor for premeditation, his answers began showing visible strain under pressure he hadn't anticipated. "You testified that you were confused and out of it during that crucial time period," she said evenly, her voice carrying no aggression but heavy with implication. "But multiple family members recall lights being on in areas where you had access. A movement that suggested someone deliberately staying awake while others settled into sleep. Can you explain that discrepancy?" Aries shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward his defense team before answering that maybe he had gotten up and walked around without forming clear memories of his actions. "So you were conscious enough to move through the house systematically," she continued. "But you don't remember whether you cut the phone line hanging directly at eye level in the hallway you walked through?" The silence that followed felt heavy with implication, Aries opening his mouth and closing it again before finally settling on the phrase that had become his shield throughout this entire process. "I just don't remember everything clearly. It was all like a blur." The prosecutor let that answer hang in the air for a moment before advancing to her next trap, understanding that repetition would expose the fundamental absurdity of claiming selective amnesia about actions that required sustained attention and tool selection. She moved to the alleged threat that formed the cornerstone of his self-defense narrative, asking him to elaborate on exactly what Tanya had said and how he had interpreted her words. "You claim she told you that you weren't going to be living much longer," the prosecutor repeated, her tone suggesting she was simply clarifying facts rather than challenging credibility. "Yes," he answered, his voice smaller now than it had been during direct examination. "You were genuinely scared that your aunt might seriously harm you?" she pressed, each question building pressure. "Yes?" "Scared enough that her words replayed in your mind throughout the evening?" "Yes." She paused, allowing silence to build tension before delivering the question that would expose the fatal flaw in his entire narrative. "Then why didn't you call your mother, or your father, or any other adult who could have removed you from what you believed was a dangerous situation?" The question landed like a physical blow, Aries hesitating as he realized the trap he had walked into through his own testimony. His explanation came out halting and defensive, something about not wanting to cause family drama, about thinking he could handle the situation himself, about not wanting to wake people unnecessarily. But the prosecutor wasn't finished dismantling his logic. "You were terrified enough to believe your life was in genuine danger," she continued, "but instead of seeking help or removing yourself from that danger, you decided to cut off the one communication method that could bring assistance into the house?" The courtroom went utterly silent, even the air conditioning seeming to pause as everyone processed the devastating contradiction she had just exposed. "If you were truly afraid, why would you eliminate the very resource that could protect you from the threat you claim to have felt?" The systematic collection and concealment of cell phones became the moment when his panic narrative collapsed entirely under the weight of its own implausibility. The prosecutor walked him through each device recovery location with methodical precision. One phone found behind furniture in a room he had access to. Another discovered wrapped in clothing inside a closet. A third located on top of a kitchen cabinet where no family member would have casually left it before sleep. "Panic is chaotic," she explained to the jury, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had prosecuted hundreds of cases involving genuine trauma responses. "Panic involves dropping things, throwing things, forgetting where you put things in the confusion of overwhelming fear. What kind of panic involves methodically gathering devices from multiple rooms throughout a house and hiding them in locations where desperate people would never think to look when they're begging for help?" Each word hammered home the undeniable reality that systematic concealment required forward thinking and deliberate execution. The opposite of the confused terror he was claiming had driven his actions. His behavior immediately after the attack became the prosecution's most devastating weapon against any narrative of trauma or confusion. "You went back to sleep," she stated with flat finality that made the facts sound even more surreal. "After your aunt was bleeding and fighting for her life, after your family was screaming and searching frantically for ways to call for help, and you returned to your sleeping area and went back to sleep." Aries tried desperately to explain this through claims of shock and dissociation, suggesting his brain had shut down to protect him from processing trauma. But the prosecutor had anticipated this defense and was ready with counterarguments anchored in basic human psychology. "Shock doesn't look like a peaceful nap," she said, her words cutting through his explanations like a blade. "Shock involves pacing, crying, hypervigilance, desperate attempts to help even when you don't know how. Sleeping peacefully is what you do when you're tired from completing a task. Sleeping calmly is what you do when you're finished with work that required your full attention and energy." A detail that had emerged during earlier testimony suddenly took on devastating significance as the prosecutor reminded the jury of a family member's account of hearing Aries humming softly to himself in the minutes following the attack. Not the sounds of someone traumatized by violence, but casual contentment that suggested someone satisfied with work well done. When confronted with this testimony, Aries denied it vehemently, claiming the witness must have been confused or mistaken about what they heard. But the prosecutor had body camera audio from those first chaotic minutes, and when played for the courtroom, a faint but unmistakable melodic humming was audible in the background, coming directly from the area where Aries had been sitting while his family collapsed into grief around him. The sound lasted only seconds, but its impact was profound, providing audio evidence of someone completely disconnected from appropriate emotional response to violence they claimed to have experienced in confused panic. The final devastating blow came when the prosecutor reminded the jury of testimony about Tanya's behavior earlier that evening, checking on Aries, asking if he needed anything, her voice filled with the protective warmth she extended to all family members who stayed in her home. "She was taking care of you," the prosecutor said softly, the gentleness of her voice making the words feel sharper than any shouted accusation. "She was making sure you felt welcome and safe in her house, and while she was showing you that kindness, you were already planning which knife to use against her." The emotional impact was visceral, grounding abstract legal arguments in the human reality of a woman who had loved the person who would ultimately destroy her life, the betrayal made even more horrific by the calculated nature of the planning that had preceded it. By the time Aries stepped down from the witness stand, the atmosphere in the courtroom had transformed completely from the tentative sympathy that had existed when he first took the oath. The jury's faces showed the evolution that had occurred during his testimony, initial openness, hardening into something closer to disgust as they watched someone systematically attempt to charm his way out of accountability for calculated violence. They were no longer asking whether he had committed the crime. The evidence had already answered that question beyond any reasonable doubt. Now they were asking why he thought he could get away with it, and his testimony had provided that answer with devastating clarity. Because he had spent his entire life learning that adults would accept implausible explanations rather than confront the possibility that someone so young could be genuinely dangerous. His arrogance, once masked by silence and careful legal coaching, was now fully exposed through his evasive answers, his shifting blame, and his fundamental refusal to accept responsibility for even the most obvious facts about his own actions. The courtroom clock continued its relentless progression above the judge's bench, each second documenting the moment when Aries' greatest weapon, his ability to talk his way out of consequences through manipulation and manufactured confusion, had finally turned against him with catastrophic force. He returned to the defense table looking slightly dazed, as if he couldn't quite comprehend why his carefully rehearsed performance hadn't generated the sympathy he had been counting on throughout months of preparation. His attorney's face showed the resignation of someone who had just watched their client destroy whatever slim chances had remained for mercy. Yin, understanding that every word spoken from the witness stand had built a stronger case for maximum accountability rather than the mitigation they had desperately needed to preserve. The jury leaned back in their seats with body language, suggesting they had heard enough testimony and were ready to move toward verdict, their questions answered not by doubt, but by certainty. Every second Aries had spent explaining himself had made the room smaller, tighter, more convinced of his guilt, and in trying to save himself with his own voice, he had made the truth louder and more undeniable than it had ever been throughout the entire proceedings. Chapter 12. The closing arguments transformed months of testimony into competing narratives that would determine whether calculated violence could be softened by the defendant's youth or whether premeditation transcended age as a mitigating factor. The courtroom atmosphere carried electric tension as prosecutors prepared to distill weeks of evidence into their final, devastating summary. The assistant district attorney rose with quiet confidence, carrying only a few pages of notes despite the mountain of forensic proof she had methodically introduced throughout the trial. Her voice remained steady and measured, trusting that the facts themselves had burned themselves into the jury's collective memory with sufficient clarity to survive any emotional appeals the defense might attempt. She understood that her job wasn't to perform, but to connect dots that had already been placed with surgical precision throughout weeks of systematic evidence presentation. The prosecution's closing argument built like a prosecutor's symphony, each movement reinforcing the theme of calculated preparation preceding deliberate violence. She walked the jury through the timeline one final time, each element stacking upon the previous to create an unshakable foundation supporting conviction. This wasn't panic, she told them, her words cutting through the courtroom silence like a blade through silk. Panic is chaotic. Panic is messy. Panic doesn't involve systematically cutting communication lines 40 minutes before violence occurs. Panic doesn't involve hiding phones in 3 different rooms throughout a house to ensure no one can call for help when screams begin. She reminded them of the severed copper wire with its clean, deliberate cuts that spoke of tool selection and steady hands rather than emotional breakdown. She brought back the image of phones discovered in impossible hiding places, behind furniture, wrapped in clothing, positioned on high shelves where desperate people would never think to look while their loved one bled upstairs. Most powerfully, she returned to the moral anchor that had grounded the entire prosecution case from its opening moments: Tanya's dying declaration. She used her last conscious moments, the prosecutor said, her voice soft but carrying devastating impact. Not to ask why this was happening, not to plead for her own life, but to warn the person she loved most in this world about the danger hiding among them. I think Aries did it. 5 words that carry the weight of recognition and betrayal, delivered not as speculation, but as final testimony from a woman who saw her attacker's face and understood exactly who had shattered her sense of safety. The prosecutor emphasized that this wasn't just evidence. It was truth crystallized into a sentence that could never be unheard, spoken by someone with no reason to fabricate and every reason to use her final breath, protecting her family from the threat she had identified with devastating clarity. The defense attorney stood to deliver their final plea with the desperate urgency of people who understood they were asking for mercy on ground that had grown increasingly unstable beneath their feet throughout the trial. And he didn't attempt to deny the brutality of what had occurred or erase Tanya's suffering from the record. Instead, he begged the jury to focus on age and the scientific reality that 17-year-old brains are still developing. That impulse control remains under construction well into the 20s. His voice carried passionate conviction as he reminded jurors that adolescent judgment operates under different neurological constraints than adult decision-making, that what looked calculated in hindsight might have felt desperate and confused in the moments when actions were being taken. He suggested that wire cutting and phone hiding could be explained as panic responses by someone whose thinking had fragmented under stress, actions that appeared systematic only when viewed through the lens of adult logic applied retroactively to teenage confusion. But even as the defense attempted this reframing, their arguments kept colliding with physical evidence that refused reinterpretation regardless of how sympathetically it was presented. The phones hadn't been dropped in panic or knocked to the floor during emotional distress. They had been systematically collected from multiple locations and hidden in places requiring deliberate concealment effort and forward thinking. The wire hadn't been torn in desperate fear. It had been cut with clean precision that suggested tool selection, steady hands, and understanding of cause and effect. The weapon hadn't been abandoned at the scene in horror. It had been cleaned and concealed in private space where only the defendant had access, hidden among ordinary teenage belongings as if proximity to normalcy could somehow erase the blade's violent history. Each fact stood alone as deeply troubling, but together they formed an undeniable pattern that spoke louder than any closing argument about premeditation disguised as adolescent confusion. The jury received their instructions from Judge Reuter with gravity appropriate to their task, his measured voice explaining legal standards they would need to apply to evidence they had absorbed over weeks of testimony that had systematically dismantled every alternative narrative to calculated murder. Reasonable doubt didn't mean all doubt, and he reminded them it meant doubt based on reason and common sense rather than speculation or sympathy for youth. They would need to determine whether prosecution had proven beyond reasonable doubt that Aries had committed second-degree murder, that he had acted with intent to cause death or serious physical injury with knowledge that his actions created grave risk of death. The defendant's age could be considered as context, but it couldn't erase physical evidence or rewrite timelines that spoke with devastating clarity about preparation preceding violence by enough time to demonstrate forward thinking rather than reactive panic. As the jury filed out toward deliberation, the courtroom settled into the strange purgatory that defines legal waiting. Time stretching and contracting in ways that made minutes feel like hours, while strangers debated the value and meaning of a life that had been taken. The air conditioning hummed its indifferent mechanical song, while families on both sides of the invisible aisle sat frozen in their separate versions of grief that no verdict could fully address or heal. Tanya's relatives clutched photographs and tissues, their eyes red from crying that had started the night she died and never really stopped, each person carrying their own relationship with loss that transcended whatever legal resolution might emerge from behind closed doors. On the other side of that fractured family divide, Aries's mother sat with her own support system, caught in the impossible position of loving both the sister she had lost and the son accused of taking her away, or her breathing requiring conscious effort as she waited to learn whether her child would spend his formative years behind bars. When the verdict finally came after hours of deliberation that had stretched across multiple days, it arrived with the suddenness that always accompanies the end of long waiting. The jury filed back into the courtroom with faces carefully neutral, trained by judicial instruction not to reveal their conclusions through body language before formal reading could occur. The foreperson stood when instructed, holding the verdict form with hands that trembled slightly, despite obvious attempts to maintain composure appropriate to the gravity of their decision. Judge Reuter asked if the jury had reached a unanimous verdict, received affirmation, then instructed the foreperson to read the decision aloud for the record. The words came out steady despite the emotional weight they carried. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Aries, guilty of second-degree murder." The syllables landed like physical blows throughout the courtroom, each one stripping away another layer of the fantasy that had sustained him through months of legal proceedings where he had believed charm and youth could negotiate with accountability. For the first time since his arrest, the smirk that had defined Aries's courtroom presence completely vanished, replaced by something that looked genuinely like fear. not the performed emotion he had displayed during his disastrous testimony, but involuntary recognition that the system he had tried to manipulate through adolescent arrogance had finally rendered judgment he couldn't charm away or reinterpret through selective memory. His eyes widened with what appeared to be genuine shock, darting from judge to prosecutor to jury as if searching for any sign that this was a mistake, a misunderstanding that could still be corrected through the right combination of words and manufactured vulnerability. He looked toward his attorney, then toward his mother in the gallery, his face showing the first authentic emotion anyone had witnessed throughout the entire trial. The bewildered expression of someone whose reality had just shattered against consequences he had believed his birth certificate would protect him from experiencing. The reaction in the gallery created a complex soundscape, mixing relief and fresh devastation in equal measure, the victim's family collapsing into each other with sounds that carried months of held breath finally being released. There were no cheers or celebrations, just the quiet, heavy sobbing of people who understood that accountability doesn't resurrect the dead, that justice is necessary but insufficient answer to loss that can never be fully repaired. Tanya's sister sat frozen between competing realities, grateful that the system had affirmed her dying sibling's last words, while simultaneously mourning the son whose future had just been fundamentally altered by his own calculated choices. Around the courtroom, people released tension they hadn't realized they were carrying, the weight of months finally breaking like fever as the verdict transformed speculation into legal certainty that would follow all of them for the rest of their lives. As deputies moved to return Aries to custody, now a moment occurred that crystallized his fundamental disconnect from reality even in the face of murder conviction. He turned toward the gallery where his family sat weeping and whispered something that looked like, "I'll be home soon," a final desperate cling to delusion that had fueled his entire defense strategy. Even with a unanimous guilty verdict echoing in his ears, even after watching 12 strangers systematically reject every version of his story, he maintained belief that somehow, some way, he could still escape the full weight of consequences his own hands had created. Judge Reuter set sentencing for 3 weeks hence, explaining that the court would need time to review pre-sentence reports and weigh factors that might influence the number of years that would be taken from his life in exchange for the life he had taken from his aunt. The bailiff led him toward the side door that would become increasingly familiar in months ahead, and as that heavy barrier swung shut behind him, Hope walked out wearing the face of someone who still believed he could negotiate with mathematics and charm his way out of the cage he had built through calculated violence disguised as adolescent confusion. Chapter 13. 3 weeks stretched like years between verdict and sentencing, each family member processing the guilty conviction through their own lens of grief, relief, or desperate hope that mitigation might soften consequences that felt both inevitable and impossible to accept. The courthouse steps saw daily gatherings of people drawn by the magnetic pull of watching justice attempt to assign mathematical value to irreplaceable loss. When sentencing day finally arrived, the courtroom filled earlier than usual with faces that looked older somehow, carrying accumulated weight of testimony that had forced them to confront truths about human betrayal that most people spend lifetimes avoiding. The air conditioning blew too cold, tissues appeared in hands before proceedings began, and the atmosphere had shifted from uncertainty to inevitability. Everyone understanding that the only remaining question was how many years would be extracted in payment for calculated violence. The victim impact statements began with Tanya's closest friend, whose voice shook despite obvious preparation as she spoke about safety shattered in a place Tanya had believed was sanctuary. "She thought she was safe," became the devastating refrain that echoed through testimony after testimony, each speaker returning to that fundamental betrayal of trust that had allowed violence to flourish in what should have been refuge. Her brother described Sunday dinners that no longer happened, birthday calls that would never come again, the way silence at family gatherings now spoke louder than any conversation about absence that could never be filled. A cousin talked about children in the extended family developing anxiety disorders. Their sense of security permanently altered by learning that danger could emerge from within the family circle rather than only from strangers lurking in shadows outside their homes. The split family testimony created the most emotionally complex moment of the entire hearing, relatives taking the stand to plead for mercy while simultaneously grieving the sister whose death had created this impossible situation. Aries' mother spoke through tears about mental health treatment rather than lengthy incarceration, her voice carrying the desperate quality of someone clinging to hope against overwhelming evidence that prison might be the only appropriate response. Other relatives echoed themes of youth and rehabilitation, emphasizing neurological realities about developing adolescent brains while carefully avoiding direct eye contact with victim family members who sat 3 rows behind them. The courtroom became a microcosm of fractured relationships that would never fully heal regardless of whatever number the judge ultimately pronounced from his bench, overlooking this theater of human consequence. When Aries stood for his allocution, his final opportunity to address the court before sentencing, he spoke in carefully measured tones about mistakes and confusion, framing his actions as tragic errors rather than calculated choices that had required 40 minutes of systematic preparation. What happened that night was a mistake, he began, the passive language immediately striking observers as revealing in its refusal to claim direct agency for violence he had orchestrated with surgical precision. He mentioned not being able to control what was happening, suggested he wasn't thinking clearly, painted himself as victim of circumstances that had overwhelmed his capacity for appropriate judgment. The performance was smooth and rehearsed, utterly unconvincing to anyone who had watched months of trial testimony revealing premeditation disguised as adolescent confusion, but delivered with enough apparent sincerity to preserve his attorney's slim hopes for mitigation. The prosecution's sentencing recommendation cut through emotional appeals with systematic presentation of aggravating factors that demanded maximum accountability within legal parameters available to the court. The assistant district attorney reminded Judge Reuter of severed phone lines that demonstrated forward thinking, systematically hidden phones that revealed calculated preparation, weapon concealment that showed consciousness of guilt, and sophisticated understanding of consequences. She emphasized Tanya's vulnerability, asleep in her own home, surrounded by family she trusted, attacked by someone she had welcomed with generosity and warmth that had been weaponized against her. Most powerfully, she returned to the dying declaration that had anchored the entire prosecution case. "I think Aries did it." Final words carrying weight of recognition and betrayal, testimony from beyond death that demanded accountability proportionate to the calculated nature of violence that had preceded it. And the defense attorney countered with pleas for leniency based on youth and potential for rehabilitation, arguing that lengthy prison sentences would destroy any chance Aries had of becoming a productive member of society rather than addressing root causes that had led to violence. He spoke of developing brains, trauma responses, the tragedy of warehousing teenagers in adult facilities where treatment opportunities remained limited, and recidivism rates suggested failure rather than redemption. His voice carried passionate conviction as he reminded the court that adolescent judgment operates under different neurological constraints than adult decision-making, that what appeared calculated in hindsight might have felt desperate and confused in moments when actions were being taken. But even sympathetic framing kept colliding with physical evidence that refused reinterpretation regardless of how eloquently it was presented to judicial consideration that would ultimately determine whether youth could mitigate premeditation. Judge Reuter listened to every statement with patient attention that suggested genuine consideration rather than performative ritual, his face maintaining neutral expression that gave no preview of decision-taking shape behind careful judicial assessment. When all testimony concluded and the courtroom settled into expectant silence, he adjusted papers in front of him with deliberate movements that made everyone acutely aware they were witnessing the transition from argument to judgment. His voice, when he finally spoke, would carry authority of someone understanding the gravity of assigning numerical value to human life while simultaneously protecting society from demonstrated danger. The air felt thick with anticipation as he prepared to address the defendant directly, every person present understanding they were about to witness the moment when hope would finally collide with reality in the form of consequences that matched calculated nature of crime that had shattered family and stolen life that could never be returned. Aries watched the judge with intense focus of someone trying to decode compassion into leniency, his eyes searching the bench for any sign of mercy he still believed his youth deserved, despite months of evidence suggesting otherwise. And he had spent the entire legal process convincing himself that his birth certificate was armor against accountability, that some combination of age and carefully crafted explanations would open doors back toward freedom he believed was temporarily interrupted rather than permanently lost. Behind his carefully neutral expression, fear was beginning to break through practiced exterior like light leaking through cracks in a foundation that had never been as solid as he had believed. The voice about to speak didn't care about his excuses, didn't accept his reframing of premeditation as panic, and was preparing to deliver numbers that would define the next chapter of multiple lives simultaneously while determining whether justice could finally pierce the armor of adolescent arrogance that had sustained him through every stage of proceedings where he had genuinely believed he could charm his way out of consequences his own hands had created. Chapter 14. Judge Jeffrey Reuter began speaking with the measured authority that transforms individual tragedy into institutional memory, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent weeks examining every photograph, reading every transcript, and wrestling with the impossible mathematics of translating calculated violence into years that could be extracted as accountability. The courtroom held its collective breath as he adjusted the papers before him with deliberate precision, everyone understanding they were witnessing the transition from argument to judgment, the moment when months of speculation would crystallize into numbers that would define multiple futures simultaneously. His first words anchored the proceedings not in legal theory, but in human loss, speaking Tanya's full name, Tanya Harper, not as a case caption, but as a person whose absence had filled every corner of this courtroom since the trial began. The court's task and the question of youth. This court's responsibility, Judge Reuter continued, his eyes moving from the prosecution table to the defense before settling on Aries with unwavering focus, is to weigh mitigating factors against aggravating circumstances while ensuring that justice serves both accountability and public safety. The defendant's youth is not irrelevant. It never is. The scientific evidence about developing adolescent brains, about reduced capacity for impulse control that characterizes teenage decision-making, has been carefully considered. For a brief moment, hope flickered across Aries's face, his shoulders relaxing slightly as he interpreted acknowledgement of his age as the opening he had been counting on throughout months of proceedings. But the judge's tone shifted with devastating precision as he moved from abstract neuroscience to the concrete facts that had been systematically proven beyond any reasonable doubt. However, Judge Reuter said, the single word landing like a gavel strike that wiped hope from the defendant's expression. This court cannot ignore that youth does not erase responsibility when the evidence demonstrates sophisticated planning and deliberate harm. This was not an impulsive act committed in the heat of sudden passion or adolescent confusion. The evidence demonstrates systematic preparation that began at least 40 minutes before violence occurred. Actions requiring forward thinking and understanding of cause and effect that transcends any claim of diminished capacity due to age. His words stripped away every carefully constructed excuse, every narrative about panic and confusion, leaving only the cold outline of calculated intent that no birth certificate could soften or reinterpret, and systematic dismantling of the defense narrative. The judge addressed each element of premeditation with clinical precision that made the defense's explanation sound increasingly absurd when measured against physical evidence that refused negotiation. Cutting communication lines is not a reflexive response to fear, he stated, his laser focus on the defendant never wavering. It is a calculated action undertaken by someone who understands that emergency services can arrive within minutes if called, and who deliberately eliminates that possibility to create an environment where violence can succeed without immediate intervention. He referenced the forensic testimony about clean cuts in copper wire, the tool selection implied by those precise separations. The location of the severed line positioned exactly where it would disable communication without being immediately visible to someone moving through darkness. The systematic collection of cell phones became the judge's second pillar, supporting his conclusion that this was premeditated murder disguised as adolescent confusion. Multiple devices were removed from their charging locations and hidden in places requiring deliberate concealment effort, Judge Reuter continued, his voice maintaining steady authority that made every word feel weighted with institutional legitimacy. One phone discovered behind furniture, another wrapped in clothing inside a closet, a third positioned on a high kitchen cabinet where desperate people would never think to look while their loved one fought for her life upstairs. A panic is chaotic. It involves dropping things, forgetting things, actions characterized by confusion rather than organization. What kind of panic involves methodically gathering devices from multiple rooms throughout a house and hiding them where frantic hands would never find them? The moral anchor, Tanya's final words. When Judge Reuter addressed Tanya's dying declaration, his voice carried something approaching reverence for testimony delivered at such tremendous personal cost. "And then," he said, pausing long enough for the silence to resonate throughout the courtroom, "as she struggled to live, as she tried to speak through pain you created, she used what strength she had left to name you. I think Aries did it. 5 words that carry the weight of recognition and betrayal. Spoken by a woman who saw her nephew's face and understood exactly who had shattered her sense of safety in the home she had opened with generosity and trust." The judge emphasized that this wasn't speculation born from panic or confusion. It was dying declaration from someone with no reason to fabricate and every reason to use her final breath, protecting her family from danger she had identified with heartbreaking accuracy. "Those are not the words of a woman inventing a story," Judge Reuter continued, his voice dropping but somehow becoming more intense. "Those are the words of someone who recognized the person standing over her. She knew you, she trusted you, and you used that trust against her. The court hears her voice. The court believes her testimony. And the court will honor her final words with accountability that matches the calculated nature of violence she identified even as her life slipped away." The moral weight of those words settled over the courtroom like a presence everyone could feel, grounding abstract legal arguments in the devastating reality of a woman who had loved the person who ultimately destroyed her life. The sentence that destroyed hope. As the judge moved toward pronouncing sentence, Aries's carefully maintained mask began showing visible cracks, his jaw tightening and eyes widening with involuntary recognition that the fantasy was finally collapsing under the weight of consequences he had believed his age would protect him from experiencing. Taking into account the sentencing guidelines for second-degree murder, the aggravating factors of systematic preparation and victim vulnerability, and balancing those against the defendant's youth as a mitigating circumstance, Judge Reuter said, his cadence slowing for the pronouncement that would define the next chapter of multiple lives. "It is the judgment of this court that you be sentenced to a term of 13 years in the Arizona Department of Corrections." The number hung in the courtroom air like smoke impossible to wave away. 13 years. For a 17-year-old, it represented an eternity that stretched beyond imagination, The entirety of his 20s, when most people build careers and start families, 4,745 days that would be extracted from his life in payment for the calculated violence that had stolen Tanya's future. The sentence acknowledged his youth while refusing to let him escape the full weight of accountability his own hands had created. It was substantial enough to represent genuine consequence rather than symbolic gesture, a number that destroyed every fantasy he had maintained about therapy and second chances, and walking away from this courtroom toward the freedom he believed was temporarily interrupted rather than permanently lost. The final collapse of arrogance. For the first time since his arrest, genuine terror replaced the smirk that had defined Aries' courtroom presence throughout months of proceedings where he had genuinely believed charm and youth could negotiate with accountability. His face went pale, his breathing became rapid and visible, his eyes darting around the courtroom as if searching for escape routes that had never existed outside his own delusions about the system's willingness to be manipulated by age and manufactured vulnerability. The performance was finally abandoned in favor of authentic panic as reality crashed through every defense mechanism he had constructed to protect himself from confronting the magnitude of what he had done and what it would cost him. He turned toward his mother in the gallery, his mouth forming words that looked like desperate pleas for help that no one could provide. The gavel fell with finality that made several people flinch throughout the courtroom, the sound marking the official transition from defendant to convicted murderer, whose next address would be determined by corrections officials rather than personal choice. Our Judge Reuter's final words carried the authority of someone understanding that sentencing represents society's attempt to assign mathematical value to moral injury through the imperfect tools of law and consequence. This court hopes that you will use your time in custody to develop the capacity for empathy that was so clearly absent when you made the decisions that brought you here today. But regardless of whether that growth occurs, society has been protected from demonstrated danger, and the victim's dying declaration has been honored through accountability that matches the calculated nature of violence she identified with her final conscious words. Justice rendered, hope destroyed. As bailiffs moved to escort Aries from the courtroom for the final time as a sentenced offender rather than presumed innocent defendant, he looked back over his shoulder with expression suggesting he still couldn't quite believe this was really happening, that somehow the nightmare would be revealed as a mistake that could still be corrected through appeals or explanations he hadn't yet tried. But the courtroom was already emptying, people gathering belongings and moving toward exits that would return them to lives forever altered by testimony they had absorbed and numbers they would carry forward into futures shaped by this moment. The victim's family released tension they hadn't realized they were carrying, tissues appearing throughout their section as relief mixed with fresh grief in ways that defied simple categorization. Justice had been served. But no sentence could resurrect the woman whose absence would echo through generations of family gatherings, where her voice would never again fill kitchens with warmth and laughter. The smirk that had infuriated observers for months was completely gone now, replaced by the terrified realization that his escape plan had led him directly into a cage of his own making. He thought he'd never be caught, had genuinely believed his age was armor against accountability, and that charm could negotiate with forensic evidence that spoke louder than any carefully rehearsed explanation. But Judge Reuter had just ensured that for the next 13 years he would have nothing but time to remember exactly where his arrogance had led him, through severed copper wire, hidden phones, and dying words that had survived long enough to destroy every lie he had constructed to protect himself from the truth that was now stamped permanently into the legal record that would follow him for the rest of his life. Chapter 15. The months that followed sentencing transformed grief into the exhausting work of learning how to exist around an absence that would never stop feeling wrong. Tanya's house sat empty for weeks while family members wrestled with impossible decisions about whether to reclaim the space or let strangers write new stories over the violence that had stained every room. Eventually, it sold to people who knew nothing about what had happened there. The address becoming just another number in a quiet Arizona neighborhood where trimmed hedges and golf carts resumed their routines as if tragedy had never interrupted the illusion of suburban peace that had always been more fragile than anyone wanted to acknowledge. Family gatherings shrank in the years that followed, holiday dinners that once required multiple tables now fitting comfortably around one. The empty chairs represented not just Tanya's absence, but the fractures that had spread through relationships like cracks in glass, struck too hard to ever return to its original form. Her chipped blue coffee mug, the one with fading floral pattern she had refused to replace despite gentle teasing, found a new home in her brother's kitchen, never used but always visible. Yet a quiet memorial to someone who had believed comfort mattered more than perfection. Cousins who had played together as children now maintained careful distance, their connections casualties of loyalty battles that had forced people to choose sides in ways that left everyone diminished. The community changed in visible and invisible ways that would outlast news coverage and court proceedings. Parents talked more seriously with their children about boundaries and speaking up when they felt unsafe, even around family. Doors that once stayed open during evening walks now closed earlier. Porch lights burned later into the night. The comfortable assumption that it could never happen here was gone, replaced by a clearer sense of responsibility toward one another and recognition that trust should be cherished but never blindly assumed. Safety stopped being an assumption and became a question people asked themselves every time they heard unexpected sounds or found themselves alone with someone whose behavior felt wrong in ways they couldn't quite articulate. Tanya's legacy lived on through deliberate acts of remembrance that fought against time's tendency to blur details until people become ideas rather than the complicated, fully human individuals they had been. A scholarship was established in her name at the local community college, supporting students pursuing careers in helping professions that had always drawn her attention. Her friends gathered annually at her favorite restaurant to share stories that kept her voice alive in their memories, describing the woman who had made everyone feel like the most important person in the room, whose laugh had filled kitchens with warmth that no amount of violence could permanently extinguish. Meanwhile, Aries began serving his 13 years in an Arizona Department of Corrections facility designed to hold people society had determined required separation from communities they had harmed. The transition from courtroom defendant to processed inmate stripped away the last illusions of control he had maintained throughout legal proceedings, where he had genuinely believed charm could negotiate with accountability. Prison operated according to rules that cared nothing for manipulation or carefully crafted explanations, systems designed to resist the exact strategies he had employed throughout his life to avoid consequences. The smirk that had defined his courtroom presence disappeared entirely, replaced by the flat affect common among inmates learning that vulnerability invites predation and emotion provides openings for exploitation. The case had demonstrated with devastating clarity the moral architecture that shapes genuine justice. Youth provides context but cannot erase responsibility when evidence speaks with sufficient force about planning and intent that transcends age as mitigating factor. Premeditation doesn't have expiration dates tied to birthday celebrations, and some actions speak so clearly about calculated intent that birth certificates become footnotes rather than shields. The quantum rule had been satisfied. The story began with injustice and arrogance, moved through systematic evidence gathering that exposed lies beneath manufactured confusion, and concluded with authority, refusing to be charmed by age or performance into accepting anything less than full accountability. For those who followed the case from arrest through sentencing, one question persisted. Would forgiveness ever be possible for family members caught between loving memories of both victim and perpetrator? Some relatives clung to hope that time and demonstrated remorse might create space for healing that currently felt impossible. Others understood with crushing certainty that some betrayals permanently alter relationship landscapes in ways that make restoration impossible regardless of how many years pass. The question wasn't rhetorical. It was genuine inquiry into whether families can survive when violence emerges from within, to whether blood connections are strong enough to bridge chasms created by calculated harm. The court's job had been narrower and more achievable than family healing. It focused on protection and consequence, ensuring that someone who had demonstrated capacity for calculated violence would spend sufficient time separated from society to represent genuine accountability rather than symbolic gesture. Whether Aries would emerge from 13 years with developed capacity for empathy remained unknowable, but Tanya's dying declaration had been honored through a sentence that matched the calculated nature of violence she had identified with her final conscious words. Stories like this matter because they show what happens when calculated harm collides with a justice system willing to listen to evidence rather than excuses. If you believe that planning should carry consequences, regardless of the planner's age, share this story so others can see what accountability looks like when it's carried all the way through. Aries thought he'd escape, believed he could outsmart adults and charm his way out of consequence. But the record, severed wire, hidden phones, dying words, and 13 years stamped into legal documents built a cage he couldn't talk his way out of. The smirk was gone, erased by the weight of consequences that had finally caught someone who genuinely believed he would never be caught. And in that certainty, justice found its voice.